I want to spend time on this final slide. And I like this slide because it illustrates the idea of a concept map. And this is something else we talked about at the very beginning of the semester. And this idea of elaborative processing and knowing how things connect together. This is an example, a real-world example, that if you can do this diagram and you can unpack this diagram completely, you understand a really big idea. So, if we start with the idea that there's a stimulus, there's a signal out in the environment. You detect it, and for a very brief period of time, it becomes sensory memory. Now, what are the characteristics of sensory memory? Tell me a characteristic of sensory memory. Tell me something you know about sensory memory. Tell me something else. It's very brief. It's very fleeting in nature. What else do we know about sensory memory? How is it stored? Is it an exact copy, or is it copied differently? Is it encoded differently than the sensory experience? It's an exact copy. It's thought to be an exact copy. And the majority of information that goes into sensory memory decays. We forget it because it's not important information. It's not information that's signaling anything useful. The parts that are not forgotten are encoded a little bit differently, and they're repeated. And where do they go if they survive sensory memory? This was the last lecture. Working memory, short-term memory. What do we know about short-term memory and working memory? It's not an exact copy. Very good. Okay, it's kind of the brain's workspace, isn't it? How long will something last in the short-term memory if you're not rehearsing it? 30 seconds. And so the great bulk of, yeah, that's on the quiz, that's right. So through rehearsal, that's a little big, things can be maintained into the short-term memory. And the great bulk of what goes into short-term memory is forgotten. That's a good thing, because if we remembered everything, we would be in trouble. And coming out of the short-term memory bubble, that worked just like I dreamed it wouldn't. We have a line coming up here to this bubble, which, what do you suppose it is? What comes after short-term memory? Long-term memory. And what do we know about long-term memory? What are its properties? Okay, takes at least 6 months to 10 years for them to be stored forever. What's that process called? Consolidation. Very good. What was the term I used for the process that allows consolidation? Close. The last word was right, and you started with the correct letter for the first word. No? I know it's in your notes. I put it there. Reverberating, very good. So there's this reverberating circuit. And you'll remember the idea with the reverberating circuit. All right, so if I got a brain, ooh, that's terrible. It's a brain that was in a wreck. We have this. So, I don't need that. There we go. So, if you'll recall, the idea here is, yeah, it's a brain. You can draw a better brain. If you recall, the idea is that the temporal lobe and the forebrain are sending the same circuit back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. For something that's important, it's going in this reverberating circuit. And the forebrain, the short-term memory, is also engaging every time the circuit echoes other parts of the brain. And that's, so as long as we keep that circuit alive, this memory is going to be laid down. If we don't do it, the memory will be lost. So the reverberating circuit is a big idea. Once I have something in my memory, in my long-term memory, if I'm taking a test and I've properly elaborated the material in my mind, I've learned what the connections are, I can go and retrieve information from long-term memory into short-term working memory, into that workspace, and present some sort of response or behavior in the world. Now, using this one diagram, I could have done the whole chapter. From stimulus to the sensory memory. So what I would do is I would print off blanks of this even. And as you're studying, go, sensory memory, what do we know about it? Fleeting in nature. Exact copy. On and on and on. You can just do this elaborative map off of these from your mind until you have this whole story. You should be able to populate this diagram and elaborate on it just like we've done. So you go through the sensory memory, repetition, the rehearsal. What are the properties of short-term memory? How is it different than sensory memory? What were the two types of sensory memory I talked about in the last lecture? The echoic and the iconic. And so the echoic memory is what? Okay. The echoic memory is sensory memory for sound, and the iconic is for visual. And again, so you need to be able to do that for this whole deal. And what I would suggest to you is a good practice is in your various classes, go back and see if you can figure out, can you develop your own concept maps. You won't always be able to, but you'll be surprised how often you are. And these are powerful because one thing, figuring out how to do them, you learn a lot. The second thing is, if you've learned this material and you're coming back to study for finals, you'll be able to refresh your memory very fast using one of these maps if you're doing it correctly. So I'm going to revisit this even though we've talked about it previously because repetition is important. So this idea of the concept map, you're drawing connections. You're putting ideas up and you're figuring out how they fit together. They help you to organize your knowledge, help you figure out what test questions might be, how things relate to each other. One way to do this, if you're one of the people doing flashcards, is find you a big table, go to the library, find a big table, lay out your flashcards of the terms, and then just kind of start doing your connections from that. That should be study tips and not study trips. Anyway, we'll let it go. So, in terms of studying again and memory, think about what things mean. Not just what they are, not what the definition is, but how do things relate to each other. In the last chapter, we talked about different types of learning. Been contrasting them to each other, you learn more about each of them. So think about meaning. Find the relationships that exist. Also notice the differences. So one of the things we love to ask are questions like, how operant and classical conditioning are alike? How are they different? How does attention lead to what you learn, what you don't learn? Use visual imagery where you can. That's always helpful. Space out your practice. We've talked about this again and again throughout the semester. Cramming is not going to work for you as good as spacing out your practice. And beware of the serial position effect. Learning the order of things is generally not that helpful unless it's something that's order dependent.